Welcome to part one of the mini-series on stability under pressure. This is for executives and leaders, but it applies to everyone. Today, I'm introducing the hidden power of allostasis and why leaders should care, especially leaders who are shaping culture, conditions, systems in the organization. In sports, there's a familiar phenomenon. An athlete can perform a skill perfectly in practice, but when the pressure rises in competition, that same skill suddenly becomes difficult. The difference is not knowledge. The athlete knows exactly what to do. The difference is the ability to execute under pressure. Business operates the same way. Many leaders understand the right strategy, they know the right things to do, the right communication approach, and the right decisions. But when stakes increase, when time pressure rises, when reputations are on the line, when the organization is watching, the gap between what they know and what they actually use becomes visible. That gap is the place to begin when we talk about allostasis. Now, allostasis describes the body's ability, it's the brain and the nervous system, to stabilize while conditions change. Instead of maintaining a fixed balance like homeostasis, the nervous system adapts so that it can operate effectively under increasing demand. So the brain is actually a prediction system. You can see this clearly in through hikers. These are the folks who will go from, for example, Mexico to Canada on a 90-day plus hike. At the beginning of a long distance trek like this, hikers might struggle to complete 10 miles in a day. And you'll see them because they narrate. A lot of them will have you can follow them on social media. But 90 days later, they'll be covering 30 miles or more per day, and sometimes for 10 and 15 days at a time. And what's interesting is they don't really look that much different. They don't look like more muscular or thinner. They basically look the same. They may look more fit, but they don't change. And that's the point about the signal that's coming through the neural pathways versus the muscles that are doing the work. The signal strength is huge, and that also has correlation with martial arts when they talk about inner strength or the inner arts. If you ever worked internal arts, if you ever were in martial arts or whatever, and you saw some demonstrations maybe, or you've experienced people who trained in the internal arts, for example, Kung Fu, Tai Chi, Wing Chun, or the external arts, Shotokan, Taekwondo, you can see the difference when they do different types of demonstrations or exercises. The people with the internal arts have this strength that's just unbelievable, but they don't look strong. And that's because the signal has been trained. Not the muscle gets trained too. But in the external arts, it's a combination of both, the signal and the muscle. But when you look at most sports, like especially weightlifting and weightlifting more so, it's the muscle. And again, another example, you look at a bodybuilder who's large and you look at how much they lift in the gym, and then you look at a power lifter who could be small and look at how much they lift. I've seen small guys bench pressing over 300 pounds. I'm talking about very small. Same thing, if you go to a powerlifting competition, you'll see the same thing. Now, I'm not talking about the strongman competition. I'm talking about powerlifting because they're specifically working in a specific discipline or specific exercise. And that's another example of the difference between muscular strength and development versus neural pathway strength and development. And you need both. You need a strong signal and you need strong muscles. And when the signal degrades, you get a plateau. So the plateaus come not so much from the muscle, they come from the signal. And it's not that it's degrading, it's that the system is creating stability and efficiency. And so how you move to lift the weight just gets more efficient. And as a result, less neurotransmitter is needed. And that less neurotransmitter results in a weaker signal because you need neurotransmitter to make a signal. For example, dopamine is a signal amplifier. Acetylcholine is a neurotransmitter that's between the neural pathway and the muscle junction. So without acetylcholine, you don't have a good signal from the neural pathway, even though the neural pathway may be trained and myelinated, but you need also the neurotransmitter between the neural pathway and the actual muscle. And this could be why if you've lifted weights, you notice you come back faster. So if you lift weights and let's say you were bench pressing to 275 pounds and you get away from it for a while and you come back and you struggle with 185. But then you notice if you just go to the gym, not just a few times, you got to start going to the gym again, but you'll notice that how you traverse through that path is a lot faster. One, because the neural pathways already have the myelin, so it's more about getting synapses in there, and that's the process of synaptogenesis, which is the pruning of the old neural pathways that are not used to the new neural pathways that are being used. So that's what we'll be talking about today. Another example is airline pilots. When you look at airline pilots, they struggle in the beginning to manage everything. They've got navigation, there's communication with the tower, there's holding their proper altitude and attitude of the plane. And all of these things are coming together. They may struggle in a 45-minute flight, but towards the end, it's easier. There's another example I use, and this is how I first discovered this for myself. I didn't know it was called allostasis. I don't think the name allostasis was even around at the time. But I decided I was in officer candidate school, and I wanted to be ready for Ranger school. So 90 days before, maybe not 90 days, let's say 2 months before, I would do push-ups with my feet up on a chair, and I would literally, now at the time I could probably do 50 push-ups because I was already in the Army and we were doing regular exercises, what they call PT. But I said, I'm going to do 5 push-ups. And I probably got this because of my martial arts training and how everything was step by step. So I said, I put my feet up on a chair and I'm just going to do 5 push-ups. And then every day I'm going to add 1. And interesting, I blew through 50 like it wasn't even there. So even though 50 may have been a struggle, I blew right through it. That was an example of how allostasis works. It's very close to what the thru hiker goes through. I've since adopted that to other things, but if you want to test it for yourself, you can actually test this tomorrow, or give yourself a week, 5 days. Sit down and do box breathing with 4 counts. 4 counts inhale, 4 counts hold, 4 counts exhale, 4 counts hold that. And then, I'm sorry, let me back up. That is typical box breathing. So you do that as a baseline. Then you do 2 counts in, 2 counts hold, 2 counts exhale, 2 counts hold that. And then you see how high you can go without discomfort, standing still or sitting still. Because if you're walking, it gets harder. But I would say that if you're doing like 7 or 8 counts, that might get you into struggle territory, so you can start there. Then go back to the 2, not the 4, but the 2. And today or tomorrow you do box breathing for just 5 minutes. Now this is going to help you in other ways too, because it's going to help calm the system. It's going to give you an anchor point so that you can come back to this stability, because this is like step 2 of my 7-step reset. You have the stability. It brings you back there just with a breath. It's an anchor. It becomes an anchor to return to calm and composure when you're hit with chaos or something that's unexpected. It's a good skill to have as a leader, because everything that hits you don't have to react to right then and there. You don't have to respond to right then and there. And because reactions come before responses, by having that breath, as soon as you feel it coming, you don't have to wait until you're consciously thinking about it. You can, as soon as you feel it coming, you can quickly shift to that calm state that you have. I recommend doing it first 15 minutes after waking up, because you're going to set that. Whether you use this moving on or not, but it's a ritual to test for 5 days. And I would also say before you start it, drink a half a liter of water. You're doing 2 things in this. One is you're hydrating. And remember, the brain, if you've been asleep for 8 hours, you're dehydrated. And when you're dehydrated, the blood moves slowly. The brain needs oxygen and it needs nutrients, and it gets those from the blood. So if the blood is moving slowly, it makes sense that you would wake up feeling in a fog. The first thought is, I need a cup of coffee. If you drink that half a liter of water, and I'm not saying don't drink coffee, it's not about that, but if you drink that half a liter of water, you'll find that that brain fog will lift. And after 5 minutes after drinking it, you may not even want the cup of coffee. Again, it's not about coffee. It's about showing you how powerful hydration is in this first 15 minutes of the day. So, and I say a half a liter. You could even do that, work on that with allostasis. You can increase from a half a liter, which is easy, that's 2 cups, to a little more, 2 liters and a half a cup. And that, I'm sorry, so I said a half liter. I meant, a liter. So a liter is like a quart. So if you do a half liter, but a little bit, and then a half liter and a little bit more the next day, then a half liter in a cup, and then a half liter and a little bit more, then a half liter in 2 cups, then a half liter and a little more, etc. So over 5 days, you'll get to almost a full liter. So now you're consuming a full liter of water first thing in the morning, and you're doing the breathing, the box breathing. Now back to the box breathing and allostasis. You start with 2 counts in, just do 5 minutes of box breathing, 2 counts in, and you can watch your phone. You can look at your phone. I use it, a watch with a buzzer on it. It's a Garmin watch, so it has that meditate component that you can customize. And I use that. I do 15 counts in, 15 counts exhale. I do that for 10 minutes. And while I'm doing that, I'm setting my system. I am literally priming my system for the things that are important to me. And this is before I have any interaction. So once I'm out in the world, once I'm doing whatever, anything that comes to me, I'm already primed for my priorities. So those things naturally take a second step. If you're not primed already, priming is powerful, but it has to do with sequence. So if you're not already primed, a prime can come in and that sequence is going to be before. So back to the breathing. What you'll do is 2 counts in, 2 counts hold, 2 counts exhale, and 2 counts hold that. And then the next day, you do 3 counts. So by the 3rd day, you'll be hitting your 4 counts, which should be a comfort level. That's where you started as a comfort level. The next day, you do 5 counts. In, hold, exhale, hold. And then the next day after that, you do 6 counts. So now you should be 4 days in, and then you do 7 counts. And watch how easy 7 counts becomes. If you want to keep going, and I do this on the weekends too, so you want to keep doing it, but then I would do 8 counts, and then 9 counts, and then 10 counts. It's going to get to a point where it gets a little bit more difficult, and this is where it's becoming more than just neural pathway signal and also about other parts of the system. So if it was exercise, like in push-ups, when it gets hard, now you're developing muscle, and muscle needs recovery. With the breathing, once it gets uncomfortable, like whether that's 7, 8, 9, or 10, you may have to stay there for a while. So you stay at 7 for a few days, and then you go to 8. And you stay at 8 for a few days, but before you know it, you'll be doing 10 counts, and it's as easy as it was doing 4. And that's a way for you to show yourself that allostasis works. Another example, as I mentioned, airline. Another one would be firefighters. And here's what's interesting. Allostasis, this concept, is not new. It's been around with ancient martial arts. Navy SEALs, Army Rangers, we use it in special ops is used. And if you notice in organizations, the ones that have life and death on the line, they use the program. That's why pilots, they have a building block program. You go into simulators and you have stressful situations in the simulator, then you fly, you go back to the simulator, and they keep extending the amount of time that you have to deal with stressful situations. They build you up. Same thing with fighter fighters. They start with a small amount of time in the fire, what do you call it, a model, a simulation, and then they have to get a break and they go back in. This is all deep practice. So we'll be talking about that throughout. And the reason I'm talking about allostasis today, because it's foundational to stability. And here's the key. Stability under pressure is not about suppression. It's about resilience and rapid recovery. And rapid recovery is a skill. In other words, if you allow a stimulus which creates a stress response, and you allow that stress response to grow, it's more difficult to process it and modulate it than it is if you catch it early. So by catching it early and processing it at that level, rapid recovery, you will automatically start improving your stability under pressure. So quick few slides just to set up the conversation. And some of, if you saw the yesterday's one, but you can see previous talks on whatever channel you're watching this, whatever platform you're watching this. There's a prior one, and they'll go in order because I'm doing, it's going to be 7 talks total. Did the one yesterday, stability under pressure, and then today and moving forward. So the 4 pillars of emotional intelligence, dynamic leadership does not compete with this. It's actually aligned to standing on the shoulders of emotional intelligence in a way. But if you look at things like emotional intelligence, self-determination theory, the 6 human needs, Maslow's hierarchy of needs, they all go back to human needs. And human needs have evolved, whether it's 10, 20, or 100,000 years, from hunter-gatherer to where we are today. But the vast majority of that time period, we were hunter-gatherers. This current way that we live with cars and computers, it's less than 100 years old, 150 years old. So most of our conditioning, our system is built around what made sense for hunter-gatherers. And when you start looking into neuroscience, it helps to use that lens because then it makes sense why we are that way. And it also gives you clues as to what you can do. But anyway, emotional intelligence is spot on, as is self-determination theory for intrinsic motivation. Emotional intelligence is more of a leadership view because it stabilizes, but the two to come together, it's powerful. And dynamic leadership uses both of those as pillars, but the other thing it uses as a pillar is neuroscience to move things upstream. Upstream both temporally in time, so you're moving from minutes, hours and minutes to seconds and milliseconds. And the reason you can move in milliseconds is because we condition it in. You can't do that with the conscious mind, but we can condition it in the same way a player is conditioned. A basketball player, for example, they can condition in to hold a fake until the player moves and then they go. That's milliseconds. When they see that twitch, they go. A boxer's not consciously thinking this person's throwing a punch. The boxer's picking up the cue and doing whatever that boxer has trained. So muscle memory is actually not muscle memory, it's nervous system memory. And that's the same thing we do in business. So that's why I put the emotional intelligence slide up there. And also to talk about how emotional intelligence was developed in the 90s. And this was before we had the neuroscience knowledge we do today, because the brain scanning tools have continued to give us more information and clean up information. So the research labs are like on this super steep learning curve, but what we get as the public, we don't see it all because it's in the labs, and because of the way scientists work, the peer reviewed and all that, it's so difficult to have a landing place and say, okay, we're going to publish this kind of information. But the research is there, and you can find white papers on it, and that's what I do. I go in and I get access to the papers that's out there. I learned from neuroscientists to become a neurochange practitioner, and that opened the door. The one thing that helped me, I shouldn't say the one thing, a big thing that helped me with is I was working on cognitive biases, coming up with ways that we could limit the impact of cognitive biases in business. And what came out of that was moving earlier in the system. So multiple things came together, but we moved from the conscious part of it to the network of neurons part. The conscious part is 50 bits per second processing speed. The network of neurons, aka subconscious, aka unconscious, aka nervous system, it processes at 11 million bits per second. It's energy. So think about it, how fast you can send an email, and the person you're on the phone with or on Zoom with, they have the email in a second or two. Energy moves fast, and that's how fast, same thing with you using artificial intelligence. So that's what we're doing. We're using a system that can process at that speed because it's energy going through neural pathways. And then neural pathways become the path of least resistance because of myelination and synapses. And that's why dynamic leadership can do what it does. And we're taking the best from emotional intelligence and dynamic leadership, but applying it into conditioned responses the same way an athlete will have conditioned best practices into their normal moves. Then that's the self-determination theory, autonomy, competence, and relatedness. These 3 pillars support intrinsic motivation, and intrinsic motivation is where you get people working hours and hours and hours, and they don't even feel like it that they're doing it. This is, and then what we do in dynamic leadership, we marry passion and purpose and provide a cone of focus. This is contrary to the thing that says follow your passion and everything else will be fine. I say start with purpose, build a cone of focus around that that's about 30 degrees on either side, and then within that you move your passion. Now if you want to do passion outside of that, if you want to have your hobbies, I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about for your business. For your business model, I say purpose and then have your passion 30 degrees on either side of that, where you can pivot back and forth, and you always have the meaning so that you can crawl over broken glass to keep you going in the hard times, and you have your passion that'll keep the midnight candle burning while you're pursuing different aspects of whatever it is that you're doing. So volatility exposes whether your stability travels with you or disappears when conditions change. This is a big part of it, because when you look at athletes and you see somebody who's able to hit 70% free throws in practice but only hit 50% free throws in the game, and even lower when the game is on the line and relying on their shot, you don't say they don't know how to do free throws. You say they're having trouble stabilizing, regulating, or something like that. Basically, you're saying they choked. In leadership, when a person does that same thing, choke, we don't say they choked. We think of, oh, that's just their personality. Oh, they need to get more training. They need to know how to do this. And then you talk to the person about going to training. They say, I already know how to do that. So what I'm positioning with this work is that the gap that you can always work on filling as an executive or as an owner building a high-performing organization is stability under pressure. That, when you close that gap, it doesn't matter if you're closing it with respect to public speaking or you're closing it with respect to dealing with a crisis. It doesn't matter. As you close that gap, it generalizes to all areas because it's about moving upstream. And we start with the 7 performance areas: mental, physical, spiritual, emotional. Those 4 are clearly in our control, although the emotional one, if you don't have good modulation skills, you may have buttons that people can push, so in effect they get to control you, but we want that in your agency. And then relationships are part in your control, but they're part in the control of somebody else. But because you're the leader, you have to take responsibility for what goes on in that relationship, and you have to adjust based on what you're getting back from them. And that's why dynamic leadership is dynamic, because we're making the adjustments real time at the millisecond level because we've conditioned it in. The same way dynamic suspension seems like it's predicting the road surface, but it's not. It's literally reacting at millisecond level speed to imperfections that comes up. It can tell through the computer programming, the algorithm, if a bump is big and sharp and abrupt or if the bump is smooth. And it's adjusting real time. That's why it says, if you look at the data, it says it makes 10,000 decisions a second. So it's essentially moving very fast, right? It's not, you can't think of it as, I don't think of it as 10,000 independent decisions. It's just processing constantly. And then we have the 7-step reset. And I cover this each time, so I'm not going to go into depth here, but this is the leader's domain, 7, 1, and 2, because we want to train the people to have the right actions. So steps 3 and 4. We may have to help with 5 to get people the regulation skills, and we can have that conversation. But the domain is 7, 1, and 2 because this is where you stabilize the system. This is where you set the conditions for high performance. This is where you set up the environment so you don't have toxicity, but you have cooperation and you have high performance. And then there's the 7 phases of the stimulus response 1-second model. This is the first 600 milliseconds, and this is what I say. There's 3 sets of 2/10. The first 2/10 is really quick. This is the initial detection. I say focus on the perpetual question and maybe some framing, some pre-framing, so that stimulus will come in through the right lens. And this will save you a lot of trouble because you don't spike. But we also will do some training here. And I call it positivity training, but it's actually resetting the subconscious to bias towards neutral and positive rather than thinking everything is a threat. Then we have the rapid appraisal. This, what works well here is implementation intentions, also breathing, anything to get back onto composure. I like to turn my head. If something comes in that I don't like, I just turn my head, and that works. Where suppressing only magnifies the whatever that sensation is that's coming on. And then the reaction formation, this is what I was talking about. If you do that morning breathing, you're setting a tone for yourself that you can come back to in an instant because you anchor it. All you have to do is take in a breath. As soon as you breathe in, if you set this up, you have to intentionally do this. But as soon as you take in that breath, you're calm. And because that's what you've anchored. Remember, you've already primed that in and you're using it every day. So it becomes a natural thing. And the more you use it, the easier it gets. And then it becomes a habit. That sensation comes up, boom, you already calm yourself. You don't even have to think about it. You don't even do it. You just think about calming. And what's interesting is sometimes with clients, especially on the early time, is there's a part where in learning this, awareness comes first. You've heard that, right? Awareness is the first step. So awareness comes first. And then it's becoming like this awareness that they're aware. And I say, we can show you the door. We can even condition in opening the door, but we can't condition going through the door, right? So you have to do it. You have to be intentional about these things that you do, but that's another conversation. And then the last part is the conscious mind. So people know way more than what they do, and that's why we talk about moving it forward. To use more of what you already know how to do, you're going to have to do it at the conditioning level. You're not going to do it at the knowledge level. And then today what we're talking about, so this is the 2 tenths. This is the 3 sets of 2 tenths. Readiness, orientation, mobilization. So there's the perpetual question example. Here's the conditioned trajectory bias. That's what I was calling positivity training. And this is mobilization, fire, trained anchor. But I have dozens of levers in all of these. Everybody responds to things differently, so we use the lever that works for them. It's a bit of trial and error, but in getting to know people, you kind of know what's going to work because you know what they're up against. And then here's what we're talking about now. Upward stabilization as a leadership strategy. Homeostasis stabilizes at status quo. So the system already does it. It stabilizes at status quo. Plateaus are predicted demand, and the system becomes more efficient, which is why you get the plateau. And the way fitness trainers work with their clients is they know that plateau is coming, so they change up the routines. But you don't have to know that it's the neural pathway signal you're working on to do that. You just know that this works to bypass plateaus or mitigate plateaus, and this is what the special ops folks know, and this is what the martial arts masters know. So allostasis stabilizes upward. So you can actually use what happens with homeostasis and status quo. You can actually use the same part of the system to build stabilization on an upward trajectory, which is what happens with thru hikers. They start out at 10 miles a day, and that's a lot, and they're tired, and they end up with 30 and 35 miles a day, 15 days in a row. That's more than a marathon every day, with very little recovery time because they're walking all day. Demand exceeds prediction, and that's what makes it work. The system, brain and central nervous system is predicting the demands that are coming, and when the demands match that, then it starts pruning back the neurotransmitter, and that energy is then used for other neural pathways because it's energy intensive. When the demands exceed the prediction, it keeps increasing the neurotransmitter, and you get this nice upward trajectory of the body getting more and more neurotransmitter. And that's why when I was saying if you use this exercise, this process for like push-ups, you'll get to a point if you move too fast where your muscles then need to recover. But you don't need to recover when you're working on the neural pathway signal because it's just the system putting more synapses in, and the system is very fast. But when you start stressing the muscle needs recovery. Very, very powerful concept because that means you can gain strength without having long recovery times during the training part. Of course, if you're doing max lifts, you're still tearing up muscles, so you're going to need recovery, but there's things you can do. And so demand exceeds prediction, and there are 7 drivers of upward signaling. Novelty, something new, intention, precision, these are all self-explanatory, complexity, progression, intensity burst, so, periods of intensity, and struggle at the edge of ability. And struggle at the edge of ability is like the inverted U that I talked about yesterday. So let's start there. Yesterday I covered the inverted U, and most people have heard of the term flow state and how to get into the flow state. I don't want to confuse this with the flow state, because the flow state is something, it's more specific. It's more like getting into this zone, but it may not be intensity. It may be just the right combination of inputs that are keeping you there. My point is this: if we're dealing in a crisis, I may not want to be in a flow state. I do want to be in a high performance state. It's the intensity might be different. So I don't want to confuse the two. What I talked about yesterday was the inverted U. And this is a good picture for us to keep in mind as we navigate this topic. So the inverted U, if there's not enough, we get boredom. We might disengage. If there's too much, we get stress. We get cognitive narrowing. And you can go on and on. The point is, this is the optimal zone. And while you may think of it as optimal zone, the optimal zone is a construct. The way you get to the optimal zone is with optimal pressure. So what's the difference? Well, too often as leaders, we will look at things or situations and focus on things like personality, identity, confidence, things like that. Those are constructs. It's very difficult to change a construct type habit. So your construct habits: identity, personality, confidence. You get the idea. Behavior habits, I mean, just whatever, right? It could be saying could be a behavioral habit. Scrolling on social media, spending too much time analyzing. These could all be behavioral habits that contribute to the constructs. And that's the point. Behavioral habits become the elements of the constructs. People try to change it at the construct level, which is very difficult. It's easier to change at the behavioral level. I'll call these the elements of the constructs. But then, where we have to start with this work is the reactive habits, because reactive habits are the antithesis of rapid recovery and stability. So if a stimulus happens, we're moving along, and a stimulus happens, we can either spike, have a mild reaction, or return to composure near instantaneously. Now, whatever happens, another stimulus is coming, whether you like it or not. And that next stimulus, if you are in presence and coherence, that next stimulus is likely external. And if you're spiking, that next stimulus is likely internal. So if we have 33,000 stimulus response cycles a day, when you're under stress, that number could probably double, because these are internal. You're in your head. And if you're in your head, you're just reacting to past associations. This is the idea. You get stressed, and then other associations come up. Next thing you know, you're stressing about this and you're stressing about that. I mean, I've seen people have a difficult decision to make, and all three options have stress. None of them are good, but they're all, a decision is needed. One decision is needed. You've got to pick one, and there's stress with all of them. This is where on-ramps help out. This is where frameworks help, because you organize the information. It becomes less overwhelming and it gives you access. You get rid of the cognitive narrowing and you push out your awareness. But then what'll happen is when you listen, they start stacking the three options. So every option has stress, has inconveniences, and they start, first of all, they magnify the inconveniences, and then they start stacking the options. So now they're reacting as though all three sets of inconveniences are all going to happen at the same time. And by the way, they're not just inconveniences now, they are Tiger on the Serengeti threat level threats. So this is why I talk about stability being a target for development. If you want to develop somebody, you can work on the skill, or you can work on stability under pressure. And if you work on the skill, the limitation is this. If you work on the skill, we already know way more than we use. We know more than we teach. And we can teach more than we do. Now, if I have a choice to develop someone, I can work on know, and I can increase this incrementally by 10%. So it builds that know vertical percent. But if I work on do and under pressure, I can grow this do by 50%. And by growing it under pressure, I'm now using more and more and more of what I know. I'm not saying don't do more know. I'm talking about that now. And that's why know, the knowledge, is a major pillar. So is habit mastery, so is state mastery, and so is performance hygiene, which could be resolving any potential areas of PTSD, etc., or wounds, open wounds. And this is not mental health. This is about performance. But that's the point. And that's why they say to really learn something, teach it. Because teaching expands this. And if you teach more, you probably will do more, because you're amplifying the signal inside. That's why I go live. Going live is a direct benefit to the signal, because I have to constantly stay, what I do, I manage myself to stay in this zone. I stay right in this zone. And little fun fact, my objective in going live every day, and I'll finish up with this because it ties right into allostasis. Millard Bennett, I first heard this concept, and it wasn't talked about allostasis. This was back in the 70s. And he was a public speaker guru. And I was listening to his work. This is audio tapes, cassette tapes, books on tape. I was listening to his work for public speaking. And he talked about taking 30 days to learn to do a handstand. And every day he would go out to the beach and spend, I don't remember, it was 5 or 10 minutes, but just practicing doing handstands on one hand. He wanted to learn how to do a handstand on one hand. And each day he went out, and I think that was what inspired me with the push-ups. But anyway, he would do handstands, and he used small improvements. Sometimes he'd have setbacks. You know how this works. You watch kids working on skateboard tricks. Some days they do them better than others, but they're constantly on this upward trajectory. So he did that, but his thing was public speaking. And what he said was, he called it a 30-10 formula. He said, every day, you take whatever it is that your thing is, your business. You know, he said his subject that time was public speaking, so it was about the subject. But he said, spend 30 minutes a day reading and learning about your subject, and 10 minutes of that 30 reading out loud. And this was the point to practice the speaking. So you're working on the mental signal, the cognitive signal, and you're also working on the muscles. But guess what? When you speak, you're activating neural pathways. When I first started going live a couple of years ago to speak for 45 minutes, I could feel a little soreness in my mouth. Not bad. You know what I'm talking about. That I've been talking for a long time. Obviously, none of that happens now, and I've gone from going live weekly to live daily. And that's just an example of applying allostasis to real work. My point is, organizations don't use this, or I should say a takeaway. Organizations don't use this in general. They do use it when life is on the line. And that's why you have to ask the question, why wouldn't I use this if I want a high-performance organization? So this is the thing for allostasis, the setup, and then tomorrow and for the next, not tomorrow, Thursday, I'll come back to stability under pressure. Wednesday, tomorrow, 7 a.m., I'll do a Ask Me Anything. And then Thursday and Friday, we'll pick back up with this series. All right, we'll see you. Feel free to jump in on the Ask Me Anything tomorrow. Send questions through or comments. I'll usually see the comments and I'll be able to respond or include an answer in the next talk. All right, we'll see you next time.